Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Campbell Robb, and I'm the Chief Executive of Nacro. And in this weird and wonderful world that we live in at the moment, I'm welcoming nearly 350 of you to an event. We'd be in a great big room somewhere near Westminster, having had a weak cup of tea and a terrible biscuit by now. But I'm really pleased to welcome you all here to this event. I'm very pleased to welcome a whole range of people from across the sector and beyond. We've got an action-packed event for you this afternoon, and we've got a lot to pack in. The title of this is A Justice System Fit for the Future. It's a follow-up event for one we held last year with the Secretary of State for Justice, Robert Buckland. But today's event is going to take in Labour's perspective, both on the impact of COVID-19 on the criminal justice system, but also to discuss how we can build a justice system that's going to be fit for the future, with a particular look at the steps we must take to reduce reoffending. So almost a year on from the first lockdown, today will be a real opportunity to look at the ever-changing and challenging challenges across the criminal justice system, and to look how things have changed through COVID, and to look forward about what we want to keep. Some of those may be good, but what we also want to take forward. Just to give you a sense of what the impact has been, it has been very significant on the estate, across the estate, real concerns, despite the significant heroic work of staff in prisons. Latest statistics from January, so there have been nearly 4,500 cases of COVID across prison, probation, youth custody services, and also that means nearly 10,000 since the start of the pandemic. And I think this is the important point, nearly 300 sites have had at least one case, which means that there will have been isolation and lockdown. And what we're increasingly hearing and seeing anecdotally, as well as beginning to see in the statistics, the impact that has on mental health, on meaningful activities, and a whole range of other things happening within the estate, which will leave so many legacy and challenges, which many of us, I'm sure, will talk about as we go on. That's why we at Nacro have been urging and continue to urge the government to vaccinate all of those within prisons, to reduce overcrowding by extending the early release scheme and by using remand only as the last resort, and to provide a much broader range of support on release, including through the provision of accommodation for all prison leavers and increased discharge grant and support getting into employment. And I'm very pleased that later on, you'll be hearing from Lavinia Aleri, who's one of our resettlement workers who works in London, particularly with people coming out of prison with significant mental health issues. And she's going to talk a little bit about what her experience has been over the last few months and what she thinks some of the things that could help those people. I'm also absolutely delighted, and in some ways neither of my other guests need to be introduced, but David Lammy, Labour Member of Parliament for Tottenham, elected for the 7th time in December 19. Following his re-election, David was appointed the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, and he's allowing him to build on his landmark review of the criminal justice system. He's also served as a culture minister and a higher education minister. And also, I think just to pay tribute to the work he's done on Windrush and Grenfell, I think all of us standing behind him and supporting him in the amazing work that he's been doing and leading on those campaigns. So welcome to David. And then Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, previously a Special Advisor to David Blunkett in the Department of Education and also in the Home Office, former councillor at Hackney Council and the Deputy Mayor of Hackney Council until she was appointed the Deputy Mayor by the Mayor of London. So a more expert and knowledgeable panel for an event I don't think we could have put together. So welcome to everybody. I'm just going to take this opportunity to play a very short video that looks back at the last year with the perspective of our staff and our people who we work with in prison, sharing their views on the impact. And then Sophie's going to be with us for the first part of the event until 4 o'clock. We're going to be specifically looking at the impact of COVID at every stage of the criminal justice system. And then the second part of the event is how we build an effective justice system for the future with David and Lavinia. So very brief video, assuming this is the moment where the tech all works and we're all happy that it does. So we're going to hopefully see a short video now.
This has affected me in every way. I'm not doing well at all.
I've been unable to exercise for almost a year. I get short of breath climbing the stairs and showering. The lack of any activity has made my life seem pointless.
I've had no work for 14 months now, despite asking many times. I'm just stuck in a cell all day and night.
We saw in the news hundreds dying each day, and they were still bringing in new remands.
We heard that thousands of prisoners were to be released early, and then it just didn't happen.
I was recalled to prison for apparently breaking the rules by helping my elderly grandparents from a distance.
And I'll cry for no reason, get very upset with things. I feel very down a lot of the time.
Not knowing anything while stuck in your cell is crazy. I can't explain how bad things are getting in my head.
Lots of people have had family members die, so are struggling to cope.
My biggest concern is dying. COVID spreads easily in the environment we are living in.
My mental and emotional well-being is suffering massively. I've started talking to myself and walking in circles like a tortured animal in a cage.
What has been the most difficult? Finding accommodation for someone on release. People with mental health conditions have been affected the most. The quality of contact with prisoners has got worse. Prison leavers accessing basic essentials. Social distancing measures has made resettlement work more challenging. What has worked well? Funding for homeless prison leavers, mobile phones provided to those without, the DWP phone line, extra phone minutes for prisoners, increased level of engagement from service users, Purple visits family video calls. Focuses for the future. We need a guarantee that everyone leaving prison has somewhere safe and secure to live. Communication with family, friends and support staff is vital. We need far better tools in prison and on release. Everyone leaving prison needs immediate access to basic essentials to have the best chance at a new start. As at January 2021, there have been 10,354 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in prison, probation and youth custody. 126 prisons or youth custody sites have had positive cases of COVID-19. 36 HMPPS staff have died having tested positive for COVID-19. Prisoners have been spending around 23 hours locked in their cells every day for almost 12 months. We have called for vaccinations in prisons as a priority, reinstatement of an expanded early release scheme to reduce numbers and reduce strain on prisons, support for those being released, including safe and secure housing. We continue to make these calls.
Welcome back, everybody. I think you can tell from that video, there's some very striking quotes. The one about feeling like a caged animal really has stuck with me for a long time, that sense of powerlessness and cageness. Thank you to everybody. But Sophie, over to you now, just to give that overview from London perspective, the impact that you've seen in London on the criminal justice system and any thoughts on what might change in the future.
Thanks a lot, Campbell, and thanks a lot for that video and really powerful voices at the beginning, really powerful and moving voices. I was particularly struck by the one about exercise and feeling, unable to do anything. I feel, I live in a very nice house in a very nice street, and I feel caged, and I'm coping with lockdown by going running. So it really struck me, being unable to do anything. I'm really sorry I can't be here for the whole of your session today. I've just got a meeting that just can't be moved, so I apologise for that. And you're right, Camby, at the beginning, these are difficult times. We have to hold these events in virtually. Sometimes that can be actually quite good because more people can engage throughout the whole country, which is really good. So sometimes it's a challenge, but also there can be an opportunity in there. Thanks so much for the video. It was really valuable to see that and to see what's worked well as some of the challenges. And I was going to pick up on some of that in my short remarks now. I'm obviously really focusing on London because I'm Deputy Mayor for London, but I'm sure a lot of what I'm going to say will have resonance throughout the country. And as you said, Cam, you've asked me to focus on COVID and its impact. And I don't need to tell anybody that it's touched every part of people's lives. And I think it's particularly touched those who are part of the criminal justice system. It's touched the most vulnerable and the most deprived in really, really difficult ways. And I don't need anyone to tell you on this call that the challenge of last year has been dealing with the direct impact of COVID, as well as tackling the issues that I think have actually just been exacerbated by COVID. They were there already, they were a problem already, but they've been exacerbated and sort of thrown into really, really sharp focus. There are two different areas, but they're very blurred. They are two different areas. They do blur into each other. Those, what's the impact of COVID and what has it exacerbated? It has, as we all are aware, just created unprecedented challenges for policing, the criminal justice system, and many, which is really important, many of the services that the criminal justice system relies on to keep vulnerable people safe, to keep them out of prison, to keep them away from reoffending, and to keep them, away from the path of crime. In a very simplistic, not simplistic, very difficult, but the most obvious way in which the impact of COVID is how services have had to adapt. And I'm sure many of the people that we're talking to today have had to, from an emergency point of view, change the way in which they're delivering their service and how they engage in a very different way. I was interested to see in one of the slides that has challenges, but it's also had opportunities in terms of some of the working. It's also a challenge. Some of the services we've commissioned from MOPAC have had to do that in terms of changing the way they're delivered. I've been disappointed that we've had to really basically put one on hold. We had the Prison Pathfinder in 2 prisons in London, which we had spent a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of effort setting up. But because of the impact of COVID on prisons, for totally understandable reasons, it was basically put on hold and got up and running again when we eased out of lockdown, and is running into difficulties again. The Met, if you take the policing side of the criminal justice system, the Met's clearly had massive impact in terms of having to enforce and explain really rapidly changing regulations to keep people safe. We've had a number of challenges in London, from shutting down protests, from a number of really difficult unlicensed music events over the summer, and also, as with every service, having high numbers of officers and support staff off sick or self-isolating. All of that is a challenge. It's not unique to policing or unique to any particular bit of the criminal justice system, but it is an absolute challenge. And it's one that's, could go into both of the pots that I talk about around a new challenge, but also exacerbated, because where you have got services that were already stretched and already, in difficult circumstances, COVID has exacerbated and made it much more difficult. And there's been the financial impact as well. There's the financial impact of COVID, and just in terms of, for example, all the services having to provide PPE for, protective equipment or masks or whatever for their staff, to make sure that their staff and their clients are safe. And of course, one of the areas, the particular areas that, and I know David, I'm sure, will pick up on this as well, is the court delays in the COVID. What has COVID done to the court delays? Huge delays. London is particularly hit by this, and given that as a police and crime commissioner, we commission the victim services, it's a massive issue for us, and it's a massive issue for the criminal justice system. And the pandemic has exacerbated the backlogs that were already there. They were acceptably high before the pandemic, and it has basically reached crisis levels now, and I think needs much more of an emergency response from the government. I was disappointed there was nothing in the budget, for example, yesterday to look at, well, what can we do around court backlogs. We have had a little bit of movement around Nightingale courts, etc., but it really isn't enough to make that really radical impact into the court delays, and to make sure that victims are not waiting for ages, for years, for their cases to come to court. But it's not just victims, it's offenders as well, because we can't ignore that impact on offenders. We've got offenders, people, whether they are guilty or not, being held on remand for so much longer. And then if they are found guilty, they may well be released immediately or very quickly. So they miss out on those rehabilitative services that could have been provided, because they've been on remand for so long, whether you don't have that same level of support or engagement. And of course, if you're on remand, although there is the ability to, after 6 months, I think it is, to be able to access support around housing, many people aren't able to do that. So they're losing their housing whilst waiting for their cases to come to court. And I also understand from conversations from MOPAC officers with prisons and prison governors that there's which will be a big concern, is that the pressure on community mental health services meant that those arriving in prison or arriving into custody at the moment are often, much more often, in more serious and severe crisis than they were previously. And that's a real worry. It means that the prison service is picking up much more severe cases of mental ill health and having to deal with that whilst also dealing with the pandemic and an emergency situation. Really worrying in London, we've also seen a trend of an increase in suicides for women offenders, incredibly difficult and worrying, but that has, we think, is a real impact of the pandemic. And of course, across the country, we've also seen an impact on domestic abuse, an increase in the incidence of domestic abuse. Of course, concern around the victims and a real challenge around making sure that the services are there. But we've also got to make sure that there are the services there for the perpetrators to try to make sure that they can change their behaviour. Again, the pandemic's been a real challenge in that way, but actually it's also enabled some innovation around that. In terms of London, we have piloted a very small pilot in London, which we've, alongside providing £1.5 million for refuge accommodation for women fleeing violence, we've also worked with some local authorities to say, why should try to answer that question, which is often the question around domestic abuse, around why should she leave, you know, and actually look at the perpetrator, look at the person that's perpetrating the violence. And we've invested in a very small, early intervention pilot, and it's for intervening where the men in most cases are causing difficulty in the home and looking to support them to change their behaviour or for them to leave the home. And the 10 boroughs have been part of that pilot. There's been 36 referrals made, and 3 of those 36 referrals were provided with temporary accommodation, and the rest were supported from home in order to be able to change their behaviour and intervene before the violence started. So there is some innovation in amongst the emergency and amongst the pandemic and the crisis. And violence again in London. We saw it dipping, the trend coming down before the pandemic. What we've got to look to is what can we do to increase that, increase the reduction in the violence and make sure that we don't post-pandemic come back into an increase into violence. Now that's a question for all the support services, especially around young people, but it's also a question that posing to our colleagues in the criminal justice system around probation and prisons, around what interventions can we look at to really make sure that those young people in particular are supported supported away from violence, are supported with their needs, their mental health needs, their housing needs, their training needs and their education needs, to be able to not go back into violent offending. And we'll continue to work across the criminal justice system. And looking forward, one of the things that I think is, again, it's a consequence of COVID and an impact of COVID, and has exacerbated what's happened during COVID, is we cannot ignore what also happened during the last year, during COVID, which is the Black Lives Matter movement, and the impact on disproportionality that COVID itself has had, and what that impact has had on our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. That's an issue for the criminal justice system, it's an issue for policing, it's an issue for youth justice, and that's something that we've really got to make sure that we don't just think about in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement in a moment in time, but that across the criminal justice system we are looking to build on the fantastic work of David's in his report, but really see that actually building back better post-COVID means building back a more equal society where we have really come to really grit that structural racism, discrimination and structural disproportionality that we're seeing across the criminal justice service. And I think that means that we've got to, as across the piece, really look about, well, what does each of the public institutions, and if we're talking about the criminal justice system, each of the prisons, probation, what are they doing to tackle disproportionality, and how, at the very first instance, employment, their own staff, how diverse and how much do they reflect the communities that they're serving?
Thank you, Sophie. That's great. David, we're going to have a chance to hear from you much longer later. Do you want to just say a couple of minutes of reflections on that post-COVID or that COVID impact? Is there anything you want to add into that before we take some questions? David, you're on mute, sorry. Okay, well, David, I
I'm struggling to unmute, but I managed to unmute. Well, thank you very much for that, Sophie, and it's wonderful to join you all this afternoon. There isn't a lot to add, but I just want to underline some of the political messages that came across in that fantastic video, and also to underline some of what Sophie has already said. And it's to say that at the very beginning of this crisis, in a cross-party environment, I remember it very well because it was the day that Keir Starmer was elected as the leader of the Labour Party, the new leader of the Labour Party. Robert Buckland said that he was going to release 6,000 prisoners from the system. And all of us thought, well, that makes sense. It was very, very depressing that very rapidly he rode back from that because of Conservative backbenchers not wanting to give an inch despite the pandemic and how that has set in. Look, it's deeply worrying for our future as a country that we've had prisoners for such extended time locked up in their cells for 23 hours a day. Very little access to education and learning. Whatever's being said currently about devices in their cells, I think we all understand that, you know, offenders need real support to learn. No access to ROTL, to employment over this time, and little access to therapy over this time. And given the recidivist rates here in the UK are the highest in Europe, this does not bode well for the future, where rehabilitation and the idea of redemption, the knowledge that we have that young people can commit offences, but so often by the time that they're approaching their mid-20s, late 30s, they want to turn their lives around. What are the prospects for that, given where we've been over this last while? And what we're also seeing, and I just want to underline this point, is the crisis that the criminal justice system is in because we did not fix the roof while the sun was shining. It was a mistake to close half of our magistrates' courts. It was a mistake to shut so many Crown courts across the country. It was a mistake to reduce the amount of sitting days in our criminal justice system. So now we have this situation of a growing backlog that harms everybody. It harms victims, of course, and it harms those who are on remand. I was staggered and shocked to see that 90% of the young people on remand in London come from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background. There's a sense in which many of them will be innocent and languishing now in our prison system. It's important, I think, also to recognise that it's very worrying to see suicide rising in the women's prison population, and alarming and shocking that the cross-party consensus that so many women have worked to get, which is that we should be in a position where we want to reduce the amount of women in prison. It was shocking to see the announcement last week that the government intends to raise the number of women going into prison by 500 places over this next period. We all understand that the vast majority of women are there because of a man, and if you imprison a woman, you are often condemning her children to the care system and to the criminal or to the criminal justice system. So you have to tread very lightly on how we treat and understand those that commit crimes that are women. So I think that clearly, and it was good to see that come across, there have been some good things to come out of this, and I've seen those sort of purple visits in prisons, prisoners being in contact with their families virtually has been definitely a good development. But actually, there's still been a tremendous amount of isolation. Prisoners have talked about the inability to touch their children, even during that break when families were able to come in. And actually, it was so frustrated that people started not to bother bringing children into prison and families into prison because it was just too heartbreaking over this period particularly. And let me just also pay tribute, huge tribute, to the frontline workers who are key workers, who I think should have been given access to the vaccine, by the way, who work in our criminal justice system, those who are working in our prisons, those in probation settings, those working in our courts, right across the system. Silent heroes, not often recognised and remembered, but it's down to them, and I thank them so much, and the voluntary workers, because we couldn't do it without those who volunteer and those who work in the third sector alongside them in the criminal justice system as a whole.
Thank you, David. That's great. I'm going to thank you for that, and we'll chance to hear from you some more. Just before Sophie goes, I know she's on a tight schedule. A couple of questions, and David, I'll bring you maybe these in later. Just a couple of questions for you, Sophie, particularly sort of on that wider place, a bit in London and specifically. How and what is your thinking about? Is there going to be a post-lockdown surge in crime, and how are you going to approach that? And have you any thoughts on what you might want to do about that? Any specific learning on what you think you've really seen in the system that needs to be fixed first? If you had a priority as we emerge from lockdown, what might that be for London?
Thanks a lot, Campbell. I mean, in terms of post-lockdown and easing out of lockdown, of course, that is a worry that there will be, an increase in crime. We're planning for that. We're, putting plans in place to try to ensure that that does not happen, and that actually we come out of lockdown and we come out a bit stronger and a bit better in terms of crime and violence. There's a lot of plans, and we're talking right across the criminal justice system around that. In terms of learnings during COVID as to what should be fixed. It really is. It may sound a little bit like applehood and motherhood. I've got it all the way wrong around. I won't try saying that again. But
what do you mean?
But it is the fact that actually what has happened during COVID has exacerbated the problems that we had already. And it's going back to what David said, we should fix the roof whilst the sun is shining. We should now fix the roof as we come out of lockdown and really think about building back better. And building back better for me means going back to the consensus, as David talks about, around trying to divert people away from prison, trying to divert people away from custody. Really good work with women, which is now looks like we've gone quite a few steps back, but we've got to make sure that we actually can do that for men, of course, where it's appropriate and where it's safe for the community, but we've really got to make real strides in that to make sure that we've got better community sentence, better support, so that actually we've got really good rehabilitation for people who have committed crimes.
Absolutely. And I was really struck with something you said earlier about actually the thing that you noticed was it's actually the services that feed into and out of the criminal justice system. We were sort of talking, those are the ones that are also being affected significantly. Social work, schools liaisons, a whole range of things that we all rely on and work and come adjunct against our services, that if they're not working, if they're being cut, or if they're not coming back in the same way, that whole ecosystem that needs to be rethought and refigured, doesn't it, to make that work? I think that's it. And I guess one final question, do you see a different role for police and crime commissioners coming out of this? Is this giving you a thinking about what that role might be, or do you think it's still settled and carries on as is?
I've always thought, and I'll fully admit that not every police and crime commissioner agrees with me on this, but I've always thought there should be much more devolution for police and crime commissioners around the criminal justice system, especially around rehabilitation and probation, so that those services that you've just described, the support services, where there is a really good understanding across a force area, that police and crime commissioners, that should be devolved down and the budget's devolved down, so that you can get much better, closer to the local commissioning, rather than it being that national piece.
I think that's a good call there, and we'll ask David later on maybe what he thinks about that. But Sophie, I know you have to go, and I don't want to keep you longer than you needed to. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us that perspective.
Thanks.
Take care, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So that's the first sort of bit of our session. The second session now is we're going to really look at the criminal justice system as a whole, and we've already begun to talk about that. You can't talk about this system as its individual parts. It has to be about the whole thing. why and how do we start to think about this in a different way as we come in? David, you already mentioned the significant increase in prison places that the government's proposing, particularly and women and in the male estate as well. At a time when so many of us are calling for less people in prison, lower sentences, shorter sentences, more rehabilitation. How do we have that dialogue and how do we change the system if we're going to be building more prisons? Also, the release process, it's just not working. We know it's not. We're setting people up to fail. So many people coming out homeless and unlikely to just not have the access to the jobs or the benefits they need. And Lavinia will be talking to us about that as well. And then, as Sophie raised, the disproportionality that's already hardwired into the system being exasperated by what's happened in COVID. So how can we begin to put together a set of proposals and ideas and coalitions? And as David and Sophie said, a cross-party consensus, which what Nacro would like to build on some of those big picture solutions that we can all back, because we also know that these are not 2 or 3 year fixes. This needs to be commitments for 5, 10 years to really make this work. So that's where we're going to try and take this debate and discussion on to now. We're going to hear from Lavinia and David in a minute, but first of all, we're going to hear just a short specific story, Darren's story, and it's a story of one of our people that we worked with as they came out of prison. So hopefully everything goes well. We're going to have that video now.
In total, I've been to prison about 6 times. A couple of times after release, I've struggled to find somewhere to live and I've had to sleep rough. I've also stayed in a tent for a few nights. It was horrible. It was summer, but it was freezing. I felt like I had no purpose. I was getting up just to walk around all day and the days felt like forever. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. I didn't want to go near anybody because I was scared of how people would look at me. Not having an address meant I couldn't claim benefits. I didn't have a bank account because I was in debt and I didn't have any ID. I ended up getting arrested because I wanted to. I needed prison support. I would just walk into a shop and pinch something to get caught on purpose. I know a lot of people do that when they've been on the streets and they can't cope. This time in prison, my Nacro worker had been helping me prepare for release. When my release day came, I was taken to reception, given the £46 discharge money, and off I went. I've never had a property before in my life. I'm actually enjoying it now. I don't want to come back to prison this time.
There we go. Just one story amongst many that we see across the system. That on that occasion, a positive one, where we were able to affect change. And Lavinia Aleri, who's one of our resettlement workers, this is what Lavinia does every day, in and out, and has been doing over the COVID period and others. So Lavinia is just going to share a little bit of her experience of what's been happening to give us that sense of perspective from the day to day. So Lavinia, and what she thinks might need to change as we emerge into the new system. So Lavinia, over to you.
Thank you, Campbell. I really do appreciate having the opportunity to speak to everybody about what we do on a day-to-day basis. It's very hard, but I'm very passionate about what we do because it does help so many people kind of get their lives in some sort of order. So I'm Lavinia. I work from a men's prison in London, and we provide support to people 12 weeks whilst they're in custody and 12 weeks after they're released. But what happens most of the time is that we end up, in communication for sometimes up to a year. I have some people on my caseload where because of lockdown, because of COVID, in terms of the support that we've had to provide, it's been even more, because a lot of people feel very isolated. We work mostly with people that have significant mental health concerns. So during the transition from prison to the community, it's very difficult, as you can imagine. In terms of the short prison sentences, it is a problem, even for us. Most of the people that we work with have been in and out of prison a lot and have not had the right support on release. So it makes it even harder for them to get out of the never-ending cycle. You know, the short sentences create a cycle of being homeless and desperate. And there's not enough time for us to help them with exactly what they need. You know, sometimes somebody can be in for 4 weeks. By the time they're seen by a doctor, you know, an in-reach doctor to assess their mental health, they are being released because there's a waiting list. Most of the people that we work with are often, you know, they've experienced trauma. So in terms of their mental health, they're very vulnerable. And we do work with many partners in the prison to kind of support them, but it's still very, very difficult. Many of the people that we work with, they receive short sentences for minor offending. And during their time in prison, I don't feel personally that they have enough time to turn their lives around. For example, you have some people that are brought in, they're homeless to start with. They have a sleeping bag, a tent, you know, very little belongings. And if they get arrested and they don't have their stuff on them, of course, the police are not going to allow you to go and pick up your tent and your sleeping bag. So when they're taken into custody, they just have the clothes that they're standing in, and they often are released, you know, with no possessions, with nothing. Most of the time, they're just given clothes from the lost property, or sometimes they're even released just wearing the prison tracksuit. We often support people when it's winter, especially. We have to contact charities and kind of get them warm clothing, because most of the time they're literally just being released with the clothes on their backs. We have found that also when it comes to hostels, so some people stay in temporary accommodation in hostels, but what happens is when they are taken into custody, their stuff is disposed of. So, you know, most of the time, some of the stuff is like passports and birth certificates. And this person goes in, and when they come out, we would go to the hostel or the temporary accommodation. The landlord would just simply tell you, oh, we've disposed of the stuff and there's nothing that we can do. This is very difficult because what it does, it puts somebody in a situation where they have no documentation to open simple things like a bank account. You know, bank accounts are something that I feel is essential, even in terms of receiving universal credit payments. You need a bank account. If you don't have a bank account, it makes things so much harder. There's processes in place, you know, from DWP, for example, where you can receive your money through a voucher. We have found that challenging at times because not enough pay points are available to pay the money to the ex-offenders. In terms of basic needs, so I believe to give people the best chance of moving away from crime, we need to provide the practical things that people need on release. So intensive support, access to basic essentials, enough money to survive, and somewhere to live. All these things are vital. Without somewhere to live, you know, we talk about things like trying to help somebody progress, but if you don't have anywhere to live, it's difficult for me as the community worker to meet you on the streets and fill out your universal credit form on the streets and then leave you there. You know, that for me, that doesn't feel good. And I'm sure for the person I'm supporting, it doesn't feel good either. It is, however, just important that we address the issue of sending so many people to prison in the first place, particularly for short periods of time. People are failed by the system. We can see that prison does not work for people with complex needs who stand little chance of reoffending when the root cause of their offending is simply not being dealt with in the first place. The people that we work with are really tip of the iceberg, and we know that so many people could be helped better when they leave in prison if they get the right support. In terms of the first 24 hours, so for me, when I meeting somebody at the gate, the first 24 hours are crucial. So that's when, you know, we meet you at the gate, you're very nervous generally. Most people, you know, they're not looking forward to being released because it's a big bad world. There's so much that they have to do in that first 24 hours. So I would, on a normal day, support people to their appointments. With lockdown and with COVID, everything has been much different. It has been easier in some instances, like we have less appointments to attend, so it gives us more time to, you know, do other stuff. So things like DWP, on a normal day, would have to go to the job centre. But now when somebody's released, we just have a prisoner advice line. And majority of the time, the advance payment is paid, you know, on the same day, which for us is fantastic. So the through the gate meeting, this has continued through the pandemic, and it's been more difficult to build a rapport. So normally we'd go into the prison and we would build a rapport 12 weeks before release. We haven't really been able to do that. The most that we can do at the moment is speak to people through the cell door because of the 23-hour lockdown. It is difficult. We do receive a lot of last minute referrals for people that have served short sentences, but we still get through it. In terms of the vital things, so at Nacro, we provide people with a mobile phone on release. And I feel like this has been a game changer. This has been something that, so many people like the probation services, the DWP, they really appreciate this, because sometimes somebody cannot be released because they cannot communicate with probation. In terms of CRC, they have advised that they will be providing phones to people who are released. This is something that we're working on together, because I think with, I know most of the probation officers in London, and we have seen that providing a mobile phone does make a huge difference. We can communicate, probation could communicate, and because everything's done on the phone, a mobile phone is very essential to one of the things that the people need. In terms of contacting the housing, the homeless lines, you do need a mobile phone. In terms of medication and mental health, so this is something that for me, because everybody that we work with does suffer from some sort of mental health issue, I do feel like people need to have the correct treatment and the correct medication, because what we have seen is that mental health issues have, heightened because of the lockdown, and people are released. And when they're released, it's lockdown, everybody's wearing masks, they're walking around, they have to queue, they've been locked up for 23 hours a day. It just causes huge problems. And what happens is the person is so overwhelmed, and there's just as much support as I can provide and their families can provide to them, but they're so overwhelmed and they end up reoffending, and they end up going back to prison because they just cannot cope with the transition. We have had some, good things that have happened in terms of the pandemic and lockdown. So we've had the HPT scheme. That HPT scheme has been a lifesaver for us, because it has meant that so many people have been released and they've gone straight into accommodation. So be it a hotel, a hostel, some people have had beautiful flats, and it's been really good. But the only downside of that is that it's for only 56 days. So sometimes I've had one person, this really hurt me, and this person had the 56 days. We really thought he was going to have an extension. He was doing very, very well. When he was released from prison, he bought himself a tablet. He was attending AA meetings via Zoom, which was so good. I was communicating with him. I was seeing him. It was in the summer. We'd sit in the park and we'd, talk, chat, would do things. So one day he phoned me in the evening and he said, "Oh, I've just gone back to my hotel room and the key card is not working." So when I contacted the hotel concierge, they just said to me, "Oh, his time is up and his booking has been cancelled." And of course, for him, it was a panic. He ended up on the streets. He relapsed very quickly, sold the tablet, and we were back to square one. So yeah, so in terms of move on accommodation, I think move on accommodation is very important. And it is something that, for me, I think will make everything easier, because once somebody has somewhere to live from there, we're great.
Lavinia, thank you so much for sharing. I don't know if you can see, all of you can see, but on her wall behind her, she says, she has a little sign saying, "Do what you love." And what really came across there is how much she loves what she's doing and the difference that she's making. If we were in a room full of people, Lavinia, you would be getting a round of applause now for really sharing and what you're doing. So thank you for sharing that. That's great. I'm really pleased that that just gives us a bit of perspective of what life's like on the ground, and that story just to the end there of how people get treated in the system. They just turn up and the key card's been changed. No communication, no identification, no thought for what that impact might be. And then we take that and we have to change the whole system to try and fix that. So we're really pleased that we've got David Lammy with us today to start to outline some of his thinking about where that might happen. So David, over to you.
Look, we all know the statistics. This is my first opportunity, really, because we've all been so caught up in the pandemic, to outline both my concerns, but also to indicate where we are coming from under my leadership in the Labour Party. Fewer than half of all prisoners are settled in accommodation after release, even though we know having a stable home reduces reoffending rates from 66% to 51%. Less than 10% were employed 6 weeks after leaving prison this year, despite evidence that having a job reduces the proportion of reoffending, again, from 59% to 39%. And just a third of those in need of good and appropriate substance misuse treatment are receiving it. Those who do reduce reoffending by a quarter, where they get that help, it reduces reoffending by a quarter. And a third of Londoners' rough sleepers are coming from our prisons. Now, in January, the government did announce some cash to invest in accommodation and wider support for prison leavers. And of course, we welcome that. We do question whether it's enough of an investment to solve the problem. And we worry it's a very isolated approach that the government is taking. And what we want is a holistic approach to solve the problem. Temporary housing alone is not adequate. We need to work hand in glove with the Department for Communities and Local Government to ensure that there is appropriate follow-on housing. The Treasury needs to understand that given this sort of bloated prison bill, if you can fix the housing problem, we will see a reduction in recidivism. You don't need more places, we can solve that. Many will need supported housing because of particular problems, and basic hostels are not always appropriate for offenders. So our strategy for reoffending would be to invest in proven alternatives to custody, including women's centres. We want to expand problem-solving courts and plug the funding gap in the female offender strategy. We want to consider the evidence for alternative and effective approaches in terms of rehabilitation. And let's be clear, it's very hard to reduce the amount of offenders in our prison system, to make the step change that we want to see, particularly in the cycle of those who receive short sentences, without a functioning and effective probation system. I was very clear at the dispatch box. Of course, the U-turn that the government did on Chris Grayling's botched probation reform was welcome, but we will watch to see how this renationalisation works in practice, and you'll understand we're sceptical as to what the government will achieve. We will argue that the justice system cannot be seen in isolation. Preventing and reducing crime requires a national, cross-departmental approach that looks at people throughout their lives, from the opportunities that they get at school, to housing, to welfare, the job market, and of course to an issue I've taken up very lively, and that's our criminal records regime. Yesterday is gone, tomorrow has not yet come, we only have today, let us begin. That was expressed by Mother Teresa, the idea that you cannot let your past define your future is a source of motivation for many. There are currently more than 11 million people in the UK with a criminal record. Nearly 3/4 of ex-offenders are unemployed on release from prison, and 50% of employers say that they would not consider hiring an ex-offender. The stigma towards people with criminal records makes it difficult for them to get that second chance. And it's worse, the criminal records regime is a second sentence for those who've already served their time, trapping people. I've seen it time and time again into a cycle of reoffence because they cannot get a job. In my review into the criminal justice system, I singled out the criminal records regime as one of the areas that most desperately needed reform if we're to break the endless loop of reoffending. This means effective support and services, of course, but it also means the need for a job. A job removes dependence on criminality for income. A job gives an opportunity for education and training. A job gives ex-offenders belief in their own future, and a job gives ex-offenders a stake in society. Prisoners who find work on release are less likely to reoffend than those who do not, and this is shown in the disparities between different ethnic groups. Ethnic groups with higher unemployment rates, like the one that I'm from, also have higher reoffending rates. And I'm not going to go back through the figures in my review, but you know that there were concerns about the 28% of Asians who are unemployed 2 years after a caution, a conviction or release from prison, and the 40% who are unemployed from Black communities. The Prison and Probation Service spends millions of pounds each year on initiatives to increase offenders' employability. They put a huge effort into worthwhile programs in education and training, CV help. I've seen it over many years, but one of the most significant barriers to ex-offenders' prospects of employment is created by public policy, and that's effectively criminal records regime. I'm happy that last year the government made modest but progressive reform to the criminal records regime as a result of my review, and that will clearly have a positive effect. But the changes were basically changes to the filtering rules. These rules applied by the DBS determine which convictions and cautions are no longer disclosed on standard and enhanced criminal record checks in England and Wales. It's my belief that we need a broader and deeper reform of criminal records. It's still the case that very minor criminal records acquired in your teenage years can haunt you years after the crime, into your 30s and 40s. Taylor Review acknowledged the evidence that most young people grow out of crime. The latest evidence is the teenage brain is not developed until 25. We need a root and branch review of the criminal records disclosure system, but there are obvious methods of specific reform that we can do first. So we believe that it's finally time to learn the lessons on the sealing of criminal records. That doesn't mean sealing it from the criminal justice system. If you get into trouble, of course, the courts, of course, the police would have access, probation, prisons would have access to your criminal records. But it does mean shifting the balance of whether that record ought to be available to future employers, in fact. And reforming the criminal records regime is not enough. We need every part of the justice system to be working with the primary purpose of stopping re-offending. Her Majesty's Inspector of Probation shone a light on how destructive homelessness is for rehabilitation in their report last year. The Inspectorate found the proportion of prison leavers back in custody a year later was 35% for those released to a secure home. For those released to homelessness, it was almost twice as high at 63%. The same report contains moving stories similar to the ones we've seen of the vulnerability of prison leavers. One man described how he kept offending to get back inside as he couldn't get accommodation. He went on reoffending for 7 years. And disgracefully, our system made one woman feel she had no choice but to return to an abusive partner's home. So lives are wasted, new victims are harmed while the system remains broken. And we want to see a justice system that really tackles reoffending, a service that protects our communities by ensuring those who've made mistakes get the support needed to be law-abiding citizens. We need to rebuild and rejuvenate the probation system. As I've said, currently the probation system is fragmented. It's been neglected, frankly, and it's been really rather chaotic and patchy up the country as to what you've got. Let us see where we get to in the summer Clearly, it will be a priority to restore the probation system back to what it once was, and we need it to now be going ahead in the future. I've talked about my position and concerns in relation to women in the criminal justice system. That is a priority. And let me just say, it's deeply concerning that since I did my review, we've actually seen an increase in the amount of young people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds in the system. 41% when I delivered my review, 51% today. It's really alarming. There's much more to do. The government still haven't implemented all of my recommendations. And as I said before, if I was delivering it today, I would have gone further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Passionate and compelling as ever. Greatly appreciate that. So we, with so many people on this call, and thank you for all of you sharing your questions in the chat, we're going to sort of go into a Q&A where I'm going to be the voice of many of you and try to combine some questions for David, but also to bring Lavinia in as well to kind of have her experience. David, we've got a broad first question, just to kind of ease you into this before they get a bit more difficult. Grace Clark's been asking, what do you think? Do you think that there's something that we need to do more with younger people to get them to think differently about the criminal justice system, both in terms of how they interact with it, but also how they think about it, how it needs to be reformed?
Well, look, I flagged the youth justice system as my bigger area of concern in the review. And let's be clear, my recommendations didn't just relate to Black, Asian, and minority ethnic young people. It was all young people affected by the system. I'm worried that the most junior lawyers are advising and working with young people in the system. I'm worried that the trend of more violent crime amongst young people, the system did not anticipate when it was effectively set up under the Labour reforms 20 years ago. I think the pipeline issues into the criminal justice system, pupil referral systems, the care systems, the huge waits at the moment for child and adolescent mental health services across the country, the really frustrating fact that young people with effectively mild learning disabilities, dyslexia, ADHD, mild Asperger's, and neurodivergent conditions are finding their way into the criminal justice system when effectively they should be being dealt with in the public health system or indeed in the education system. We've got to be more joined up. I'm concerned that the phrase looked after young people is one of the biggest oxymorons in the English language, frankly. They're far from looked after. Too many of them finding their way into the criminal justice system. Sophie talked about divergence, really important. And of course, the huge cuts, 50% to so many local authorities has hugely affected the prospects for young people. There's a lot of patting the system on the back because we reduced the amount of young people in the criminal justice system. I'm not sure we reduced the amount of young people from a Roma, a Gypsy or traveller background. We certainly haven't from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds in proportion. So there's a lot to do. And effectively, I'm signalling that a Labour government would be up for very serious youth justice reform. It's something that we'll be looking at very closely over the next few years.
Thank you, David. I mean, our own experience at Nacro, we published a report just last year with the voices of young people on knife crime, for example. And it was very clear from their voices that the thing that they weren't worried about was harsh sentences. The thing that worried about them was that the system didn't trust them. It was other people, and that diversion was the absolute key to that. But they just didn't feel listened to by a system. And that
can I also just stress on that point? I'm afraid the system is. A lot of the emphasis on knife crime, of course, is understood. But look, we've really got to get behind why young people are running serious amounts of cocaine up and down the country. It's adults that are pimping those young people. And what is the system doing about those adults? Many of them men in suits, many of them men who don't have my complexion, by the way. Most of the young people I've met trafficking drugs do not know where Colombia is, and they certainly haven't got the means to organise the transshipment of vast tons of cocaine from Colombia through to Holland, Spain, and into this country. That's being organised by serious organised crime, and we need to hear far more from the National Crime Agency about what we're doing to tackle that crime, because it's those individuals that effectively, it's a chain that ends up pimping young people. This is no different to what we read about in Oliver Twist with Fagin, pimping young people effectively in the 19th century. And here we are, hundreds of years later, and we're still seeing the same thing.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on now. We've got a series of questions from a number of people about the discharge from prison. So specifically, how would you, and Lavinia, I'm going to ask you to come in. How would you change that to ensure that certainly that people don't end up homeless as they come out of prison? The questions around that. How can we reform and rechange that system so that people have a better chance? We see every day.
Should we hear from Lavinia first?
Surely, David. I'm very happy to do that. Lavinia, your thoughts on what would make it easier for you? What are the 2 or 3 things that would really make a difference to your job day in, day out to make that discharge more positive?
So for me, first of all, just the short prison sentences don't help the matter at all. And also the rapid recalls. You know, you have people being recalled because their phone battery died and probation couldn't contact them for a few days. For me, it's a waste of time for us. It's a waste of time for the prison services. It's a waste of time for everybody. In terms of things that need to be in place when somebody is released, it's very simple. You know, get this person organized, get them somewhere where they can sleep at night, get them somewhere where we know where they are. So if I need to support you, I know where you are. I can make applications on your behalf, and I have an address to apply for things. A mobile phone, very simple. So if these things are in place before the person is released, and this is what we're trying to do in our job. So in the 12 weeks before release, this is what we're trying to get in place, but we can't do this for everybody. You know, the people that we work with is a very, you know, special type of group of people who are the most vulnerable. But I think this is needed for everybody, because somebody might not have mental health issues, but when they're released, they don't know who to contact to get, you know, the right support. They don't know who to contact to get into housing, to get universal credit payments, and they just end up, you know, reoffending and back into prison. So it's just the simple things for me, the housing, things like the phone, and just somebody to support them, or places that they can even go to get this kind of support. You know, at the moment with lockdown, there's nowhere to go. You just have telephone numbers and the internet. If you don't have internet or a phone to call anybody, what do you do?
Absolutely, Lavinia. And every time I ask Lavinia and our colleagues, what's the most difficult thing about discharge? The most common thing they say is access to stable accommodation. That's, I mean, it has to be the bedrock. And I don't say that just as the previous Chief Executive of Shelter and Joseph Ramsey Foundation. We know that every day that alongside a discharge strategy, which gets that day-to-day right, we have to have that accommodation strategy which puts that in place as well. So David, over to you, your thoughts on discharge and making that, giving that best chance of a second chance from day one.
Well, clearly housing is the key, and we need a step change in the UK. We need that to be prioritised, and clearly it's not something that the justice system can fix alone. It's got to be with the support of colleagues in housing and local government. We need a very serious strategy, and it has to be targeted around how we're going to get offenders access to that housing, and what's the numbers that we need across the country, and how, amidst the housing crisis that we sadly have across the country, we are going to deliver it, and what's the ambition and over how many years. And there's nothing like that currently. There hasn't been now for well over a decade, and without that, things are not likely to get considerably better. But there are some other things that I think are really important. We've got to end Friday releases. They've made strides in Scotland. We're lagging behind here in the UK. You cannot release people effectively into the abyss of a weekend when the services they need are not open. I think that's a significant problem. You've got to fix the challenges around ID and rapid access to benefits that still exists for many prisoners. And of course, there has to be the real support, not just around skills, but around employment. And that goes back to some of the comments I made previously around the criminal records regime, and reminding people that 1/3 of people on job seekers allowance have a criminal record.
Thank you. And thank you for your support for ending advisory releases. It's something that NACRO is passionate about, and we're arguing all the time and hoping to see some movement in that. So we really appreciate that. A whole series of questions we've had here. I'm going to try and just lump them together in a sense about, first of all, about sentencing. And we've heard from Lavinia say it a number of times now around short sentencing, in the youth justice system as well. I wonder if you've got any specific thoughts on that. And then the follow-up to that is therefore the government's approach to prison building, with the extensive now, because of the increase in sentencing and the length of sentencing, we're also seeing an increase on both the men's and the women's estate. Now, you touched on that a little bit, but I think a lot of people are asking questions about, can you tell us a little bit what your thinking is on sentencing, particularly short, and then into the prison?
I don't see merit in short sentences. Again, this was a consensus that was building across the system. You know, if we went back a few Justice Secretary, David Gauke was showing some leadership in relation to ending short sentences. Buckland and Boris Johnson and Priti Patel are driving things in completely the wrong direction. And again, look, I recognise the need for new prisons, because we've got a very Victorian estate in parts of the country, and we need to renew it. And we need to have the sorts of facilities in our prisons, particularly that can promote employment and training that are fit for purpose. But we should not confuse new prisons with new prison places, given that we are outliers. If we went back just 20, 25 years ago, we had a prison population of 45,000. No one has explained sufficiently why Britain now needs a prison population of 100,000. Why do we intend to more than double the prison population when we've not seen that proportionate increase in the population of the country? It doesn't make sense. It's as if we're giving up on rehabilitation entirely. And just to repeat, but of course the NACRO audience knows this, the vast majority of prisoners will leave prison. So it's a false economy not to invest in those prisoners to make sure that they don't go back.
Great. And Lavinia, I think just to re-emphasize what you were saying, your experience of working particularly with clients who are on those shorter sentences, that disruptive, that kind of in and out thing is something that makes it even harder for you, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, for me personally, it's very frustrating. And it's been particularly frustrating the past maybe 8 months, because with the lockdown, people are coming out and they just cannot cope. You know, we've had meetings where we're having conversations, not only with me, you know, other partners in the prison and outside of the prison. And the conversation is always the same, you know, why is this happening? I've literally got people that come out and they're back in, you know, in a week. And for me, it's, if you're working on this person's case for 3 months and in 1 week they're back in prison, it's kind of, sometimes it makes you feel like, what am I doing wrong? But then when you look at the reasons why they've been recalled, or the reasons why, you know, they're back in prison, you think, oh my gosh, you know, I had one person that he stole a sandwich from Greg's and he was in prison. And it was just like, why did we need to do this? We could have worked within the community and avoid this prison sentence. And the prison sentence meant that he lost his accommodation, he lost his belongings, he lost everything. And then he was in for 4 weeks, and then we're having to work on his release once again. And it's unnecessary for me.
Indeed. And David, I mean, I think you probably, but there are lots of questions coming in about individuals still serving IPP sentences, the recall rates also rising. Do you think would you be looking to review or reclassify those types of sentences?
Look, I really, really hope that we can, despite the challenges, achieve some sort of cross-party consensus on IPP sentences. And I say that because, of course, they were introduced by a Labour government, and David Blunkett's very, very clear. The implementation of IPP sentences has been a catastrophe The original intention was to protect the public from a very small number of incredibly dangerous offenders. And sadly, many low-risk offenders are currently serving IPP sentences for relatively minor past crimes. And it's tragic, really, the situation that they now find themselves in. The other real concern is it's punitive against offenders that present often with neurodivergent conditions. You know, they get recalled, or they can't get out of the prison system because they're slightly more chaotic prisoners. They don't follow the rules, if you like, in the conventional way, and they find themselves caught up in this. So we're in this situation where the MOJ and the Secretary of State doesn't want to take responsibility because they're worried about Daily Mail headlines. The Parole Board doesn't want to take responsibility because it feels under pressure and is also worried. And so these individuals are languishing in the system. I'm afraid we've got to find a way for all of us to take responsibility. And that's why I say it's got to be cross-party. And there's got to be a consensus that for this group of prisoners, it's cruel and unusual punishment, frankly, to continue in this condition. And where and there is a consensus where you've got David Blunkett, Jack Straw, Ken Clark, all recognizing that this is an issue. Robert Buckland ought to be able to act in a cross-party way.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move on now. You said this in your, somebody had written this question before, but you said it earlier on about how if you were writing your report now, you might go further. And I think people would be interested to hear in maybe one or two of those areas where you think you should have gone further or would like to go further now, knowing what you know now. Well,
we haven't touched on the judiciary. I'm afraid we've got to have a representative judiciary. And, you know, that representative judiciary, by the way, is not just in relation to Black, Asian and minority ethnic judges. It'd be nice to have some women in bigger proportion. I set a target in my review. It was rejected. And I really think that we do have to have a target. And some believe that there should be a quota. Because, of course, trust is lower in ethnic minority populations. We're seeing this at the moment, by the way, on vaccine hesitancy. The trust in the system is lower. People's own experience of inequalities in health and their own experience of structural discrimination with the broader system means that they're less likely to present. And that's similar in relation to how people are feeling about the judiciary. I've talked about the reforms that are really necessary in the youth justice system, particularly. That's where the pipeline is. If we've got 51% of young people coming from Black, Asian and minority ethnic, as night follows day, those young people are heading into the adult prison population. And what I found in my review is that per capita, the situation for Black men in this country is worse than the United States. So we've got to act, we've got to do something. I think there was also, I was really impressed with some of the work that I saw in New Zealand. And this was around community justice, restorative justice, working with Indigenous people, gathering around first, second time offenders. There are some deferred prosecution pilots being run as a result of my review. This is where you're not forcing young people down the, guilty, not guilty. You're dealing with the problem in front of you. Is it anger management? Is it drugs or alcohol? What's going on in the home? We've got to have more of that approach. We need to move beyond pilots so it's widespread across the country. The direction of travel in this country is the wrong direction, and that is that you remove local justice, you shut down your magistrates' court, and justice is further and further away from local communities. What I'd like to see, for example, is I'd like to see not just Highbury Magistrates' Court in my part of the world. Why can't we have the court sitting for one day a month in the Broadwater Farm Community Centre, which is only 3 miles up the road, but is a lot closer to the action with local people gathering around that first-time offender, second-time offender with their parent or parents or their guardian and really working to address the issues. It's got to be more joined up.
I think that's great to hear, David. Lavinia, I was going to ask you in terms of, because that important part about community and family surrounding people when they come out, and do you see that and experience that, and how does that impact on your work? If there was more support, more ability to draw the justice system closer, to make it less intimidating for those friends and family to support people as they try to?
Well, definitely. I mean, I think that is fundamental, and wherever actually you see recidivism fall, you see outcomes better, that is what is happening. But let's be clear that in our country at the moment, it's not just the broad message that we're not getting that right, but it's very patchy across the country. And that affects very different kinds of communities across the country. It's very patchy indeed at the moment. Yeah, and I suppose the other thing to say is we had a budget yesterday. No mention at all of the justice system. Justice has lost out consistently in spending reviews, in budgets over the last decade. It's been cut back to the bone, and yet again we heard nothing about spend in our area. It doesn't bode well when we're in a recession, and we know that in a recession, on the whole, offending behaviour goes up. When we read and understand the mental health crisis that's affecting so many people as a result of the pandemic, as night follows day, that will lead to offending behaviour. The question for us is, are we going to deal with that in the criminal justice system, which cost a fortune, or are we going to deal with it in the health system and the education system? And, you know, I fear that yet again, it will be the criminal justice system that's asked to pick up the pieces with no extra resources.
And one of the challenges that always gets played back, David, is, and that's absolutely right, is that, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, it's the court of public opinion. You categorised it as people being scared of Daily Mail headlines. Any thoughts as you?
Well, yeah, but yeah,
how work together. Those of us who care about the system, who want to have, is there something to be? Is that a barrier, or do you see that as something that we're all going to?
Well, we have to push back slightly because, you know, when I did my review and I was able to travel around the world, there was a political consensus emerging in the United States, where there were Republicans raising this bloated federal prison system. They were challenging 3 strikes. And actually people like some of the decision-making of Bill Clinton and Joe Biden was up for being examined in the past. There was an emerging consensus in the United States of America. This is pre-Trump, of course. Thank God we've gone back to the Democrats. There was a consensus emerging in Canada, a consensus emerging in New Zealand. There were pioneering work being done to reduce disproportionality in all of those countries. The only country, sadly, where there was very little consensus was Australia, which has a significant problem in all of these areas. It has been so depressing to see this government turn its back on the progress even that David Cameron was making. David Cameron asked me to do a review into the criminal justice system because he understood there was a problem. Theresa May set up the race disparity unit because she understood there was a problem. And what do we hear now? We get this hardline dog whistle consistently every single week from Priti Patel, where it appears that she's deliberately stoking it in order to garner votes in the leadership election to come after Boris Johnson steps down. So I'm afraid we have to push back against this because there was a political consensus emerging. You can find that political consensus. This is not just an agenda for those that read The Guardian. This cost a fortune. Some of it doesn't work. Quite a lot of it doesn't work, in fact, and it needs reform like any public policy area. Just as we update education practice, just as we look once again at health inequalities, it's not rocket science that we can look once again at attitudes to offending and how we get the best out of the system. That ought not to be some sort of liberal cry, that's a cry for a common evidence-based approach to what works and what doesn't work. And so I think there's no backing off here. We have to be bold and courageous about the arguments that we know that matter and the things that we know that work. And for example, we know short sentences don't work, and conservatives have taken that view, as well as those at the more progressive end of the spectrum.
Thank you, David. That's great. I'm going to come back to you in a minute to give you a final word. I think we're coming to the end. I was wanted to, Lavinia, just to, if you were to kind of sum up what the impact of what you see and the thing that would most help you change the impact that it has on those that you work with, what would that be? What was your rallying cry to leave with the people that are on this call with?
The main thing for me would be obviously short sentences. We've said that so many times. Also, the 23-hour lockdown that is happening in the prisons that's been going on for a year. I think that is so damaging for so many people. Even if you don't have mental health issues, by the time you do that for a couple of months, you will, your mind is not going to be the same. That is very concerning for me, very, very concerning. You did mention families as well. So what I've found in terms of families, a lot of families are very angry with everything that's going on. Obviously, they can't do visits. When they do have visits, there's no contact in the visits. Visits have been off for a very long time. Purple visits is something that, when I first heard about it, I thought, oh, fantastic, this is going to be really good. People can communicate with their families, but it doesn't work very well, unfortunately. So I think families do need more support, because it's very hard to have somebody, in prison. And with the work that we do get very close to families. So before the lead up to somebody's release, we will meet with the family or speak to a family, speak to mom, speak to dad. And, we kind of have to carry on our shoulders what they're going through, because it's very difficult to be away from your family member, not being able to see them. You don't even know if they're okay. They know that they're in this 23-hour lockdown situation. There's COVID. So it's so many things worrying. So I think families need more support. The whole system needs the short sentences. No, early releases. I'm definitely, I think that would really help, just to kind of decongest the prisons, because they are very, very full. Yeah, it's the main thing.
That's a good shopping list, Lavinia. We're going to work with that. I think one of the things that is absolutely clear, however, is that we need to be investing now in mental health support for those that are currently in prison, as the lockdown eases, for those that stay in prison, but for those that come out. But we haven't got extra resources to be able to support those people with the challenges that they're undoubtedly going to face as a result of that severe kind of 23-hour type lockdown. I think that we've got a sort of bubbling crisis coming our way, and I think that we certainly at Nacro will be pushing hard to see what support we can have in prison and out of prison for that. David, I wanted to give you the last word. Well, I'll actually have the last word, but nearly the last word. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to say anything that you hadn't said or anything you want to finish off with before I close this off.
Look, I think there's very little that I haven't said. I think the sector knows me quite well and knows I've got quite strong views that more or less align, I think, with Nacro and some of the positions you've taken over many, many years. Look, I would say this is a particular moment. We have seen a departure in some aspects of what the government's saying. I am worried, because clearly the pandemic and a recession particularly leaves us in a very tough and challenging place. We will need resources. We will need innovation. Not all of this is about, equality or equal ops. A lot of it's actually about what works and what makes the system efficient. And I just want to once again reiterate my thanks to the sector, to the frontline workers right across the sector, to those who volunteer in the criminal justice system, to the wonderful third sector organisations that we have working in the criminal justice system that makes a huge, huge difference and are often unsung. And that's what I'd want to underline particularly.
Thank you, David. That's very kind. I'm going to pass that all on to Lavinia and her colleagues because they're doing that every day, day in, out for us in Nacro. I think we've had an extraordinarily wide-ranging set of discussions there. Some really interesting, certainly from just wanted to also recognise your support for the reform of criminal records, something that we have a criminal record service at Nacro, which does a lot of work with people, as you know, and I think that support for really thinking through the whole system and working out how we do that differently. We'd certainly be willing to share our thoughts and what we learn every day from that with you and that wider review, because it's a hugely important piece of work that needs to happen. As you say, we passionately believe at Nacro everybody getting the best chance at a second chance. And if you've got something hanging on behind you like that, that really does hinder your opportunity for employment, for getting a home, from getting everything at all. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your honesty and openness and transparency and your passion for what you do. I'm going to ask everybody, you get this all the time, but a virtual thank you to Lavinia from everybody. This is not what she does on a day-to-day basis. We had to tell her that it wasn't really real. There wasn't 350 people on the call to make her relax a bit. So thank you, Lavinia. Thank you to Sophie as well, who joined us earlier on, for her contribution in London. To everybody out there, we see there's lots of questions and comments coming in all over. We're going to make this available, obviously, as soon as we can, as much of it as we can. We'll get those comments sent around to people so we can share, keep that discussion going. We at Nacro want to work with everybody in the criminal justice system, because I think, as David said on a number of occasions, what we know is we all need to work together. Whatever part of the system we're in and whatever political party or persuasion we're in, we need to work together to keep the system and make it work better, to get less people into it, less people in prison, out of prison quicker, and a better chance for a life when they come out of it. We're really grateful for David Lammy for his time and his energy, to Lavinia as well. I hope you all stay safe and you had a good evening. Thank you very much for your time. Take care. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well done for making the panel diverse in terms of gender and in terms of ethnicity.
Thank you, David. Well, we hope to keep doing that all the way through. So thank you for your time, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.